Well, welcome everybody. My name is Matt Casey, and I am the Associate Director of Graduate Career Services here. My role on a daily basis is to provide direct support, advice, and resources to our graduate students in arts and sciences, the School of Engineering, and SMFA. But for today's conversation, I'm thrilled to open this up to all of our communities across schools here at Tufts for a topic that is, I think, relevant to all of us as part of our career, or most of us anyways, for our career planning process. And starting this workshop earlier in the semester, given the fact that we are going to be having there will be networking events and recruiting events and career fairs. So having a discussion and a conversation and sharing some insights and best practices about resumes and cover letters as you prepare for your career and for upcoming opportunities this year. So let's get started. In every presentation that I provide here at Tufts and many others, this is a slide that always is incorporated. And I think this is important for any of us, if we are at any age and at any time, if we are 8 or 80, is that making sure we all realize that career planning is a process and that everybody falls along this continuum at any given time. Sometimes you can run things concurrently, but it is very hard to skip steps. We have workshops, content, and resources and advising on each of these topics for all undergraduate and graduates and alumni through Tufts. For this conversation, though, today is we are talking about marketing tool development, in particular, resumes and cover letters. So a few pieces around resumes and cover letters, and what we're trying to talk about today is thinking about best practices. And oftentimes this is how we might feel when we are tasked with initially trying to build a document like this. Here's what our expectations from the career planning process and from the career services department. We do not expect you to be experts in resume and CV and cover letter writing. These are uniquely curated and cultivated skills, and they're very unique. They're opportunistic as you're trying to create a personalized, branded document for specific opportunities at specific periods of time in your life. Those times change, those roles change, the documents change, the expectations change. So as we're talking today about best practices, is realizing not only are we talking about how to optimize your documents now, but also provide you links and tools and resources that you can use moving forward, including templates, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel or create something necessarily from scratch. Be able to use some of our resources, our best practices that have and will continue to work in the future. There's a quote by Martin Yate, who has a book called Knock 'em Dead Resumes, which has been popular, I think, for 2 decades now. And I think it's been a #1 bestseller in this category for a few decades. And he wrote, your resume is the most important document that you will ever own. And I do agree with this for professionals, with one caveat, is that I do think this is a transactional document that communicates your experience and value to a potential employer or a potential investor, or to educate somebody about you. I will say there's probably a third leg of this stool, and that LinkedIn is becoming a consistent, normalized addition solution as part of educating people about their careers, where the resume is a historical document about experience and expertise. A cover letter is a very targeted document to describe your expertise and experience and relevancy for a particular role. And your LinkedIn profile or social media, depending on social media profiles, is a third way to sort of demonstrate experience and expertise in a more dynamic way. You can show more information, more pieces. You can have more of a history. It's more of a narrative. It can be in first person. So just being thoughtful about the conversation today, we are not going to discuss the mechanics and fundamentals of LinkedIn profile development. There are workshops that we have on our website, and we will have them. I expect additional ones this year. But for this conversation, we're going to talk about the resume and cover letter. And for the conversation today, there'll be times where I'm going to use the words resume and CV. And for today's conversation, I'm going to use those terms interchangeably. Historically, there have been considered large differences between resumes and CVs. Resumes were professional documents to get opportunities and jobs. CVs were much longer, more biographical documents focused on academic, it could be teaching and academic roles or clinical roles. The reality is that in the modern world, they're becoming hybrids of each other. There still are situations when you will have a more lengthy CV, and we do have a workshop around those details. But for today's conversation, because 95% of the content of those documents tends to be similar, we'll use those terms interchangeably today. So that is how long you have between when an employer picks up your resume or reads it on the screen for the first time and decides if they're going to keep reading it or put it in the no pile. It's about 6 seconds, which certainly doesn't feel like a very long time. But having been an executive recruiter and colleagues as well, is that this is very true. You know, the initial impression of a document like this is very quick. But the advantage here is that we know that this is the behavior of the hiring managers and recruiters when they're initially looking at these documents. And if we know that that's the behavior, we can help you curate a document that not only gets 6 to 10 initial seconds, but gets another 6 to 10 and another 6 to 10 until they make a decision to reach out and have a conversation with you. So when we're talking about the elements and best practices of what best resumes are, one is they're interesting, is that you have this 6 to 10 second initial engagement with an audience where they are going to decide how they want to connect with you. But this document is designed to tell a story and create interest. It is interesting because it's interesting and being interesting is that a resume is not a biography. It is not designed to capture all of the information. It's designed to capture the most relevant and meaningful and interesting information to create the narrative you're looking for somebody to reach out and have a conversation with you. So it's biographical without being a biography. And that document, as we'll discuss in more detail, is a combination of 4 elements, which is formatting, content, messaging, and flow. What you see in front of you is an example of a resume. And it could be any resume. This happens to be sort of a 2-page content. Actually, it's 2 separate resumes. But what you're seeing in front of you in these color shaded areas are heat maps. A large recruitment firm hired a company to do a qualitative study to understand how hiring managers and recruiters looked at resumes. And what they found is that when they made initial impressions, they used eye tracking glasses to see where their attention focused when they looked at these documents. And where you see darker red colors, where they spent more of their time. Historically, with traditional resumes, what ends up happening in that initial overview of 6, 10, 20 seconds is that when these recruiters and hiring managers are sort of gazing over this document, they're looking for, there's about 6 things they look at. They're going to look at the name, the organization if you're currently employed, where you're working, and so the name of the role, the name of the company, the dates of when you were there, previous dates, and education, dismissing likely a lot of other pieces. That is an antiquated way to sort of look at a document. And because it's hard, we want to translate more information. By curating a modern document, we don't want to have a document that they're used to reading. We want to create a document that allows them to find the information you want them to find, and they read it the way you want them to read it. So they are looking for optimal pieces of information to keep their attention, to keep learning more. The best resumes are also accurate. A lot of these topics we're talking about, best practices, are maybe obvious, but when writing these new documents, what we're saying is that you could be the most qualified candidate, but typo errors, content errors, omissions, lies, sort of very, very specific grammatical errors will and does dismiss sometimes the most desirable candidate. Because the idea is that if your most important document for your professional marketing has errors in it, what could it be saying about your credentials or your attention to detail in the work? It doesn't mean that's necessarily true, but all of this is about perception. So making sure, I'm a fan, there are technologies that can evaluate resumes. Grammarly, there's third-party software that will look at your documents and make sure everything, information. The one caveat to this is that you don't necessarily have to write in complete sentences all the time in a resume. There are times where fragments. So just recognizing this is not a blanket statement. There is a little bit of flexibility in how this document is created, but try to minimize, if and I would say eliminate, meaningful errors. They're also relevant. And when we're talking about relevant, they are featuring industry vocabulary, and that's important. So for instance, if you were applying for a role in healthcare, you may want to, depending on what that role looks like, you may be speaking about ICD-9 codes or DRG codes, or speaking about sites of care or lengths of stay, if it's a clinical space. But if you're working in engineering, there's specific vocabulary there. If you're working in sports or you're working in international relations, whatever those pieces are, and a lot of that vocabulary either comes from the industry itself and how it's relevant, and a lot of times it can come from the position description. It's always, in addition, it's keyword searchable. So making sure, and we'll go into this a little bit more, the vocabulary used in the position description, or they are vocabulary consistent with the position, a position like this, but not explicitly expressed in that document, gets in there. Because if you're using technology to submit an application to an organization, which is oftentimes the most common, they're using a tool called an applicant tracking system. So that tool uses software, AI, machine learning, where it's really going to break down the content of your document, and the software is going to decide if your background and experience is relevant, and should that document be shared with a recruiter or hiring manager within an organization. So just being thoughtful about that information and what gets scanned. And the idea is that the resumes with relevant keywords are more likely to get found by recruiters, not only when they're submitted to online opportunities, but also if they're loaded up on other sites or shared with other folks. So just making sure it's not just about what you did, but making sure it's connected to what you're looking for. I think also really strong resumes are titled. And there's a variety of ways to think about this, but the way I think about title is usually whatever the title of the position you are applying for is. So not the one you may currently have, the one you are applying for that's in the position description, putting that at the top of the page. And there's a reason for that, is that when you have 6 to 10 seconds for somebody's initial impression, and they see this for the first time, that document could be about anything. What we want people to realize is that by putting a title at the top of the page, it sets the expectation for the reader of what to find on it. So instead of it just being about anything, if you picked up a sheet of paper off a table and just looked at it for 10 seconds, how quickly would you discern what that document's about? Putting a title on it sets the expectation for what to find in that document. So instead of it being about anything, it's about this. So all the things we're sharing today are not prescriptive or directive. They're just examples of best practices that are helpful, but also we're trying to communicate why those things are helpful. So putting a title on the page. And think about putting a title is not unlike putting a cover on a book. Is that this is what this could be a variety of books on a bookshelf, but the one that has a cover that has a title and maybe an image on it, maybe the one you pick up because you know what it's about. So thinking in those terms and can be very, very effective, especially from when the recruiter's reading it too. And they're maybe reading hundreds, if not thousands of potential documents. And the best resumes are also accessible. So when you're thinking about your job or internship or fellowship or opportunity search strategy, is that two things I think are important when you're sort of managing your career opportunities. One, it should be very easy to find you. And when people find you, it should be very easy to understand why you're valuable and why you're interesting. What you have in front of you right now are just examples of sites where you may upload a resume. Handshake would have those pieces, or your tool here with Tufts, and that's searchable by employers. LinkedIn, I think it's situational. We don't tend to always put a resume in a LinkedIn profile simply because a lot of the LinkedIn content is related to your expertise. But there are targeted job boards. There are recruitment firms that allow you to upload your resume so they can search that and may find jobs for you, because a lot of organizations don't necessarily use recruiters in their own company. They hire a recruiting company to find talent like you. Indeed's another example of a large targeted job board for those graduate students, or could be anything, PhD jobs, so very targeted job boards. And then there are other sites like ResumeUp is a virtual resume platform. But it's just to demonstrate, as you're thinking about your strategy, is that we want to make sure you are accessible and then marketed well in your plan. So as we're talking about building blocks, how a document is created and what we'd like to see in it and how it can be structured. So as I mentioned before, your resume is a marketing and branding document that showcases skills, experience, and potential. But really, it's an advertisement. And I think that's important to recognize. To think of ourselves in some context like a product or service doesn't hurt. It doesn't mean that's all we are, and it doesn't limit how people are construct. But it does recognize the fact that an advertisement is a promotional tool to help educate somebody or help them understand or make a decision about a product or service that they're experiencing. So when we're thinking about this advertisement or this promotional document that shares a lot of information about who this person is and why they're unique and valuable, there are 4 pieces to that. So first is format. Format is how the document looks and is structured. Content is what you did in describing it. Messaging and tone is how you describe that. And flow is how information is strategically and selectively organized in the document that makes the most sense to translate your value to the reader, which means you may have your you may have the executive summary and then your education and then professional experience, or you may lead with something completely different, like maybe workshops you've worked on or certain types of credentials. There's no singular way to develop these things. There's a lot of flexibility. And when we talk about format, I think it's important to recognize is that there's no single preferred format for resume development. There is an unlimited variety in what can be curated and developed. And that's really important. I think 2 things are really critical when you're building that document. One, it should be very easy to understand why the person in this document, what the initial document's about. It could be a title, or be able to understand what the context of this document is. And the second thing, and this is true, again, undergrads, grads, alumni, et cetera, showcasing why this candidate, is valuable and interesting. So if you can accomplish those 2 things quickly and thoughtfully and contextualized, you're more likely to have your document read. These 3 examples are just showcase. They're not advocating for structure in any way. It's just saying these are different ways that you can visualize information. One of the big questions that comes up is about resume length when it comes to formatting. And there are a variety of positions on this. What I can share, from our team and for somebody myself who's worked in marketing and branding and strategy and a little bit of advertising and being an executive recruiter and a hiring manager, is that the one-page document is something or somewhat of a myth. Your document does not have to be one page. A one-page document is somewhat of a relic of a different time when people were submitting resumes by envelope, and that people would physically have to open them and, have loose documents coming out of it and be able to track them. With documents that can most of the time being submitted some way virtually and can be looked at on a screen, there's less problem with losing a potential document. So we're advocates of, when you're creating this document, is letting the initial length of your draft of your document is dictated by the content and the relevant content. So your document may work out where the one page makes the most sense. But we want to let you know, and I want to make this clear even to the undergraduates who are on this call as well as the graduate students, is that it's not the age that we're concerned about. Your relevant experience and expertise and insights are what this document is trying to develop. So, as I'll show you some examples, is that if you have a variety of these things that are connected to this job, you start realizing if you try to create an artificial length structure on a document, but you have all of this interesting and relevant insight and experience, what ends up happening is, if you're trying to get it to one page, it's hard to describe and contextualize that experience. So you end up having a one-page document that looks an awful lot like a list in some cases, and it is really hard to differentiate your candidacy with an uncontextualized list, right? So it's how we actually look and read information. Well-designed, well-developed, well-structured, contextualized documents get read. I would say you start getting into 3 or 4 or 5 pages, our maximum, and it's dependent on individuals, but I would say 1 to 2 is pretty consistent across the board for now. The old benchmark used to be 1 page for every 10 years of experience. That, again, I think is somewhat of a legacy concept. So just being thoughtful of the fact that what you bring to the table dictates the initial draft of this document. Very important to remember. So you have formatting, and the other thing with formatting is that there's a lot of flexibility in margins and length and structure. What I would say is a lot of consistency with fonts, but you can change fonts depending on the document. I would be thoughtful about your margins in your pieces. So and what there are standards around applicant tracking systems, all of these details that either we can share with you specifically, or there are tools we can share that can give you insights as well. So then there's the application to, or applying to, a particular opportunity. And this is important, is your documents, your resume, and your cover letter should be customized to the role that you're applying for. Now, we think from a career planning standpoint around making sure that all students and alumni are thinking about their career in the form of targets. So some of you may be graduating this year and considering the fact that you may have multiple interests and multiple opportunities in multiple areas. You may be interested in consulting. You may be interested in maybe being a bench scientist. You may be interested in being an astronaut. You may be interested in running your own business, and you may be qualified significantly for all of those things. What we want to make sure is important is that we make sure that you understand what your targets are, and targets are just clusters of similar jobs. So if you're looking for jobs being an astronaut, you're going to have probably a similar resume and to some degree a cover letter for those documents. A one-size-fits-all general document is something we highly discourage. And this is because in the modern workforce where so many applications are submitted online, and even if they're not, but let's just say it's submitted online, is that it is hard to triage all of this information and make sense. We do not want to leave it to the reader to make a decision about what this document is about. What we are trying to avoid is somebody looking at a document, reading it, drawing a conclusion, and drawing an inaccurate one. So, which is why we're talking about some of these constructs. Is your clusters of targeted documents will be, I would usually are very similar. So if you're looking for data analyst jobs, you may be tailoring it to the position description with certain vocabulary or structures, but overall, most of that document stays the same, but it may be significantly different from a different career in consulting, for instance. What you have in front of you is just an example of a position description or a job description that actually existed. So when you are applying for jobs, thinking about specifically what the responsibilities are and the qualifications. This isn't how all job descriptions are laid out, but it's very, very common. Is a list of responsibilities, usually hierarchical. So the higher the bullet, the more important it is, the relevance to the job. Not always, but more than likely. And then qualifications, what the expectations and what the needs are of that job. In this particular case, there's compensation, which is even better and slightly unusual now. But with new state and federal guidelines, that's going to change. There's going to be a lot more salary transparency as you're thinking about interviewing negotiation. So just something to keep in the back of your mind. But you're customizing your resume and marketing documents for individual specific opportunities. So seeing the vocabulary, seeing the expectations, and thinking about how your expertise and experience fits that role. When I was speaking about the length of the document and the content, this is a summary of content possibilities. It is most definitely not an exhaustive list. It's that this list can be incredibly extensive. But the idea when you start thinking about your career, even as a first year here, or as a 6-year PhD student or an alumni, is that you start thinking about your experience and my education. Like, oh, I have honors and awards, or I do have community engagement and leadership experience. Oh, I've done professional development and credentialing work. Oh, I have teaching and mentorship experience. Oh, I have shadowing experience. Oh, I have applied academic projects across disciplines, and I'm pivoting, so I want to highlight those pieces, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the idea, is just to remind you, is that your document, from a content perspective, I think can and should be, in a lot of ways, curated topically and contextually, but just reminding the fact that when you're building your documents, thinking about these pieces. So want to feature an example of information on this resume. And again, none of this is directive or prescriptive, but some thoughts and some best practices, or as you're thinking about your document, whether or not you're doing this for the very first time, or you're looking for some very specific nuances or differentiating strategies that give you an advantage. So the documents almost always start with contact detail at the beginning. Most definitely your name in large print is helpful. Adding your pronouns is something you can add. If you have credentials, for instance, so if you've usually at the master's or the terminal degree, PhD level, or if it's a legal, a JD or an MD, et cetera, thinking about the fact is that if you've earned those credentials, it may be relevant and find their way, and that's on a case-by-case basis. Should you put your full address in the contact details? Our recommendation is no, is that except for unless it's expected or asked for, most likely you are going to submit a document through a tool or by email. So the correspondence you're going to have with an organization is either going to be through email or through phone. Very unlikely until maybe the end, where somebody might send you mail for a contract. So in the modern world, especially the virtual one, is that if you do want to put your location, let's say you wanted to work, in the Boston area, but you lived in Lexington, for instance, what we would say is put Boston, Mass, or Cambridge, Mass, as your location. All that does is indicate to the hiring manager or the recruiter where you are generally. Either you are there or you intend to be there. In a lot of ways, you oftentimes can just leave on the location with the expectation that you'll find your way to get to wherever that organization is. Your phone number is important. Usually for US based phone numbers, I would leave off the international +1 just as a matter of course. It's certainly not used here, and may bias candidacies. And that's the other thing with putting the full address on a document like this. We don't want anybody to go onto Google Earth and put in your address and be able to look at your front door. So we don't want anybody's candidacy to be biased artificially, and I would say, unscrupulously, by something that has nothing to do with your competency of candidacy. So there's also your email address. While you're at Tufts, I think you're free to use Tufts. And when you exit Tufts, I think the best practices now are either a Gmail account or a personalized email address. And this is a lot of times goes with ageism. So for instance, if I put AOL .com into this feed, people might look at it and say, that's my parents. Or if it's Yahoo, it's me. Gmail is age agnostic and experience. So again, we're trying to unbias your candidacy and easily accessed. If you have a LinkedIn profile, customize the URL to your name can be very, very helpful. As part of the process, organizations, when they're reading your resume, if they like your resume, they're going to go to your cover letter. If they like your cover letter, the next thing the recruiter is going to do is either go to your LinkedIn page or they're going to Google you, and then they're going to do the other thing. So just being present for the fact, we're not directing you, if you're comfortable and have a LinkedIn profile or a portfolio profile that you are willing to share, that's where we'd say, and want people to learn about you, you can put it up here. So I know it's a lot of information just about who you are, but we want to make sure that information is easy for them to contact you, who you are, so they can move on to the other pieces. We mentioned the job title here, and the structure we have in this document, again, is just an example of how things can be structured. In this particular case, it's just a job title could be placed up top. Then education. So when I think education, just when you're thinking about putting it into a document, education for recruiters and hiring managers is a checkbox. So where did you go to school? Where was it? When were you there? And what was the title of your degree? And if your GPA, and this is this artificial boundary, if it's above a 3.5, feel free to add it. You don't have to add it. We just recognize that is a curious benchmark for excellence, which again, incredibly arbitrary, but you can add it there. And then otherwise, we tend to think if you have a thesis, a capstone, or a final project that you want to allude to, is you can add thesis and the title, and you might be able to add relevant coursework depending on the nature of what you're trying to explain. But the reality is, just to remember, is that putting all your experience at Tufts under your education section is confusing to the reader, because it's more likely and beneficial to find it somewhere else. So if you have leadership roles, we want to find in those areas. If you have campus research or teaching assistant work, adding that experience to those sections. Then the next thing you have are curated, customized section headers. So I mentioned before is, your document, your experience is chronological, but organizations hire by competency and by skill sets. They're looking, can you do this job? Many times just putting your chronological experience forces the reader to have to read all of your experience, understand how they all relate to each other, and maybe they do, maybe they don't, and then see how that's relevant to the work that they're doing. What we're letting you know is that you have incredible and almost unlimited autonomy to decide how your information experience is curated. And this is something that career services can certainly help with in an individual level, is how do you organize that information? If you're applying for a healthcare marketing job, for instance, showcasing these pieces. And depending on the role, that experience could be contextualized in a variety of different ways. So just thinking about the fact of how you organize the work and the experience you've had. And you can treat academic projects just like you treat work. So a lot of the programs that you all are in are experientially based. And if you spend a day, a week, a month doing a project that has a purpose and work to be done and a learned or an outcome or something that you deliver, it's just like a job. You may not get paid for it, but the skill and the competencies go along with those pieces. We want to make sure you understand if like don't disacknowledge the fact that your experiential learning opportunities are directly related to work. And oftentimes you get the opportunity in school to actually develop and learn more about something. A lot of times you don't have a semester at a job to learn and develop something. So that's sort of the unique value proposition a lot of times of some of the programs that we're in here at Tufts. You'll see there's a leadership, community engagement, and service section. All I want to call out here is there are times when you may want to describe experience, and there are times when you may just want to list it. The idea is that this document is a marketing document to get you a conversation or an interview. So it doesn't have to explain everything. It just has to be relevant, interesting enough for somebody to want to pick up the phone or email you, to dialogue, to get more information, to have the 20-minute phone screen or the hour-long, initial interview. I'll also say, sort of with bullets, as you're sort of showcasing information, when you're describing what you've done, just making sure it is action-oriented and it is focused on what you did, who was it for, and why was it valuable. And there's a variety of ways to do that. But when you're showcasing, if you're putting content on a document like this, we want to know why it's relevant. Creating just lists of facts are hard to react to. So, and there's a variety of different ways to do that, but just recognize when you're describing experience in your bullets, making sure they're specific, and when measurable or quantifiable, you can add those things. So sometimes you reduced something by X amount, or you increased sales by this, or you added this kind of headcount, or you made this leap. But not every outcome is measurable or quantifiable. So there's a lot of variety. And the last thing I'll say on this particular page is having a skills and competency section. So the idea is that for a lot of jobs, they're going to be software tools or instrumentation tools or other programs or resources or applications. The ability to not only know what those things are, they're either relevant or you want them to understand, but also curating them by topic areas. So, if you have data analytics or analysis skills, I think it is important to showcase where everybody is. It's like, MS Excel, Qualtrics, SPSS, like if you have information visualization presentation. So the idea is a running list of experience. By curating them topically or by competency, you're telling the audience, not only do I know how to use these, I know what these skills are, I know where they go. Again, in a nice way when you're curating a document to sort of make it crystal clear about your experience and your expertise. This slide is here just to demonstrate the fact this happens to be a former graduate student, just to showcase a different layout, not prescribing that this is what you should use, but seeing 8, 9 different headers, and there could be more. And you see that education is up early, and then research and publications, and skill sets are on the second page, and there's internship experience. But there's a lot of flexibility to this structure. So just recognizing that you are not beholden to a certain way, and we want to make sure that we can help with that process and curating that. And 2 more pieces I want to call out when it comes to content with resumes. And I do think this is not specifically for graduate students or alumni, but I think it can be beneficial for all professionals, is when it warrants it, and oftentimes it does, is having an executive summary becomes helpful. Think of the executive summary as a breakdown of your background experience that's relevant to the role. So when I mentioned before, when you're looking through a resume or CV, and it doesn't have a title or an executive summary, the person has to read the whole document and draw a conclusion. What we're saying is that the executive summary, which is not unlike an abstract in a paper, for instance, is that it draws the conclusion with information, and then the rest of the document backs it up. So just when you're thinking about curating your documents, having a title of the job, underneath this, you could have a list of competencies. A list of competencies are things you can do. Diversity, inclusion, leadership in this one, or cultural sensitivity, equity, inclusion, or critical race theory, whatever those things are. Usually those competencies are either pulled directly from the position description or they are terms consistent with a role like that, but not explicitly expressed. That's helpful from a keyword searchability, but what it's really doing is it's telling the reader that you either know how to do or have exposure to the responsibilities of this job. And it's a way for them, another layer for them to filter the right information in your document. And then you could have bullets around experience and expertise, or you could have highlights and outcomes. We just wanted to let you know is that an executive summary with the word executive is not specific to executives. When you think about a professional summary that puts all the pieces together and makes sense out of your background for an audience, saves an incredible amount of time, and that you get to own the narrative, and that's the huge benefit. And lastly, I'll mention for those of you who may have, it could be a simple job or it could be a complicated job. Sometimes when you're sort of breaking down your experience and expertise, you can describe your job. You can break down what you did, who you did it for, what your role was. But if there's an 80-20 to your job, 80%, you can describe that job, responsible for this and had this budget, and then your bullets become outcome driven. So all we're saying in these slides around resumes is how much variety there is to what you're trying to do. And for today is to making sure you can see how much of that variety and give examples of how these things are organized. So you know that what you may have thought about these documents is much more robust than what it may have been. There is a consideration around graphically based resumes. We'll just say this, is that the ability to visualize information, and the picture paints 1,000 words, I think is incredibly valuable. What we have found is that in the marketplace hasn't caught up to a typical graphically based resumes. These are just examples of how to showcase something like that. What I would say for future thinking was when you're building a graphically based, if you're thinking about this, have a traditional text-based resume formatted, and in addition, a nice to have is a graphically based resume. And we'd certainly, the career services, we'd be happy to discuss particular elements or structures around this, should we be considering them. So a lot of information about resumes. We're going to cover just as much detail in depth around cover letters too, because I think there's a familiarity with resumes, but cover letters are often what are they and what do we do with them, and and how do we maximize these? This is, myself included, is trying to initially drafting cover letters. And this is, again, these are writing cover letters are skills, trying to create a curated, crafted document that's designed to showcase your expertise and your interest, and doing it per position is something that we can learn or develop or teach. But we do not expect you to be experts in this, and we do have examples and templates to be able to work from. And we will be talking about basic best practices today, so we don't feel like this. So quickly, when you're writing a cover letter, target each one to the audience. Generic cover letters, they can be read, but they don't add value. But here's the thing: unless explicitly expressed in a position description that they do not want a cover letter or a tool like this, always add one. It is astounding the number of times, even though it's not, it's recommended, but it's not a have to have. A cover letter allows you to control the narrative and why you are valuable and interesting. And we have seen it, and I personally seen it, but all of us on our team have seen situations where there are candidates that were ideal that did not submit cover letters that were frustrating to us, and there are candidates that were resumes were I'd say passable or okay, but astounding cover letters that gave frameworks and allowed us to want to have that conversation. So making sure it's focused on that particular role is important. And it is really important to recognize the cover letter. The cover letter is technically about you or about the writer, but really the cover letter is about the organization you're applying for. and why. And it's, your cover letter is trying to do two things. It's trying to say, why you, why now, well, why this position, why right now. And it's also trying to say, why are you valuable and why are you interesting? And it's doing it in a certain page length. Again, you're not relegated to a single page. There's a lot of variety when it comes in structures to these documents. But it is about showcasing value and unique experience, why you are related to this job and why it would be important for them to connect with you and discuss it in more detail. You do not have to do any of this by yourself. Again, we have tools and templates and, we can help with content and editorial work, and always have with both of these document resumes and cover letters, always have other people read them. Even people that aren't familiar with your field, different audiences can see different things to provide insight or structure or advice to what your document is, maybe something you missed. Don't reinvent the wheel. Don't be generic. Do not forget to proofread. So preparing, sitting down, have a target job in mind. I think the fourth bullet here, just saying being patient, is that a lot of this is iterative and there's no singular way to do it. And then again, tools and resources and have people read the documents. But let's go through some best practices. So what I would say from your cover letter as well as your resume is that they should look like they come from the same person. So if you're submitting a cover letter and a resume, your header should be exactly, so your name, your phone number, location should be exactly the same. The margins should be the same. The font type should be the same. Should look like it comes from the same person. The font sizes can be different. You just don't want to have two documents about the same person looking like they came from different people. There is, having a date, if how it's structured and who you're sending it to. One thing people will ask is, how do we direct this the cover letter? If you know the name of the person you're sending it to, dear, salutation, and last name. If you don't know, we typically will avoid to whom it may concern. It's awfully generic. Dear hiring committee or something like that works very well. Oftentimes, even though there's one person hiring, there's usually multiple people in the process. This covers that. This is an example of a more direct cover letter where it is experience and fact-based. It's designed to, I'm applying for this position. Here's why I'm valuable. Here's overview of the experiences that are related to this role and a call to action of why I should work there. So when you're thinking about starting a direct cover letter like this, the first sentence is, I'm applying for this job in some form or frame. The second sentence, often but not exclusively, is my background experience of A, B, and C is relevant to this job, and I'd love to discuss it with you. That's paraphrased. But what you're trying to do is to generate, quickly understand what this whole document's about. And then the subsequent paragraphs, however they're structured, are again around experience and value creation. So this person is saying, I have 6 years of experience doing this and 4 doing something additional. I have worked with these audiences. I've done these procedures. I've connected with these audiences. And across all these experiences, I've learned this and developed this and become this. In addition, some more information. It could be about your experience and expertise. And then a resolving paragraph. So, and we do have examples of all of these to be able to work from. But we just want to think, when we're talking direct, is you're usually not adding a personal narrative to it or a reason necessarily. It may be, why this particular job. This one is around, like, I have the skills and I've done this, but maybe you have a value-based experience. Maybe there's something personal to you that you want to relay in a document. What we'll say is there's no singular way to create these documents, and to be recognized, your own tone of voice or your own tone of writing is important. There may be cases where you want a direct document or a bulleted document, but there may be some cases where you want to explain it. Many times, the person, for those of you who may be in graduate school, for instance, but even it could be something for undergrad, your personal essay to get into university, or a personal statement, often becomes a very nice template for a narrative cover letter because it speaks to some of the whys of something. So it's just thinking about different angles of showcasing information, and they're all potentially effective. This is a different example where it is more, this happens to be mine, And I mention this because even though myself and all of our team who do advise students here at Tufts work and develop and curate and have specialization in cover letter and marketing document development, it is really hard to be objective about your own brand. So the last 3 or 4 resumes and cover letters that I've used, I personally hire a professional resume cover letter writer that I work with to help build this narrative. My document version was different. This is something that the person I work with curated. This one's topically driven and bullet outcomes. So I'm not really explaining anything so much as I'm showcasing relevance that I feel like is enough. That's in my back experience is so connected to a role like this. Uh, Instead of maybe transitioning or pivoting to a role where you may have to describe those experiences more. And then on the second page, it's more about why I'm connected to this job and maybe some soft skills. What I would say around when I speak about hard and soft skills in these documents is just making sure when you're building them is that hard skills are data analysis is a hard skill. Organization is a soft skill. Soft skills are things that are hard to measure, like detail oriented can be or attention to detail or like hardworking, organized. Adding them judiciously can be useful as part of context, but if you think it's a really important part of that job, usually telling a story or giving an example where people can infer those soft skills can be useful, or telling the story and then saying these are the soft skills I developed in that space. And just to make things showcase, some slight differences as we go through this piece, is that this is an example where there really is a lot of variation, where this is what was an incredibly successful cover letter, which doesn't speak to the role, doesn't speak necessarily to particular hard skills, but is more speaking to a value system and a state of being and a direct connection to the work that's being done and the organizations and the people that do the work in these spaces. So this is a personal way to write a cover letter, and this was a very successful way. And I just as a way to demonstrate some polarity of how these things can be curated. What I will say as a caveat to this is that in this particular case, the person who's applying for jobs is a clinical role, a physician assistant, which is a credentialed role. So you have to pass a test, and your state you pass the test and you're approved and licensed. So if that's true, if there's a third party governing body that's doing this, this person doesn't necessarily have to describe their background because the credential does it for them. But this was a very, very, very clever and thoughtful way to make a personal introduction. And although I think there aren't a lot of applications for this particular skill, I can tell you is one of the most successful cover letters I've ever seen. Just to be able to keep these aspects in mind is that as you're curating these documents, but they should be about you and your relevance and your expertise and your interest in that role. As you're building your documents, I will just mention a resource that can be very useful. It is called JobScan. Tufts does not currently have a license for this. It does have a robust free site. The paid version, which is very inexpensive, does have an incredible amount of value. So what this is, as I mentioned, the applicant tracking system, which is the online tool that organizations use to filter documents. This is a ATS, applicant tracking system emulator. So what it allows you to do is either take the content of your resume or the content of your cover letter in one box, and then you could upload a position description in the other. And when it does this, it uses AI and machine learning to do a comparative analysis, score that job, and then provide a variety of elements of feedback on that document. What I will say is I typically ignore the score, but do pay attention to some of the feedback in this document, particularly around keyword frequency, because it will read these documents, compare them to other position descriptions. And oftentimes you may have skills or competencies that they are looking for that you never mention in your document. So what it is a way, at a very minimum, it's a way to, as a technological check to make sure you have the content you need in that document. But it also does, when the paid version does predictive, so it'll actually recommend words that aren't in the position description, but they're terms consistent with a role like that. We're just saying this is one of a variety of tools that are out there to supplement the process that there are things you can do on your own, you can do with the career services department, and you can also leverage technologies. We do have a resume and cover letter section on our site. We will be adding more. There are templates and resources and an undergraduate and graduate resume guide. We will be adding several more of the examples I've showcased today to this site, and we'll make sure, and we have the addresses for everybody from this presentation today to be able to send to you. So we are incredibly grateful for your time and focus today. It's exciting to go through this process. It's such a fundamental aspect of the work that what we do and what we're trying to do to make you ideally the most desirable candidate for all the positions you seek in your career. We know how experienced and excellent the work you do is and why you're valuable, and making sure that we help you curate documents that are the accurate reflections of the brilliant work and experiences you have. So we're very, very grateful for your time, and I'm happy to stay on to discuss anything or answer any questions you might have.